Welcome back, dear students, to yet another lecture on the history of English language and literature. And in our lecture today, in our class today, we shall discuss in general about the Victorian poetry. So this is an introduction to the Victorian poetry. We know that the Victorian poetry would come after the Romanticism, after the Romantic poetry. So we shall discuss something about an introduction about the Victorian poetry. We have learned that the novel was the dominant literary form. Novel was the dominant genre of the Victorian era. But poetry that enjoyed a cultural status as in the past. So though poetry was in the shadow of the dominant genre, which is novel, it enjoyed a cultural status. The Victorian poetry enjoyed a cultural status as in the past, even though the most dominant genre was the novel. So in our class, in our lecture today, we shall explore what shaped the Victorian poetry. The Victorian poets wrote poetry with themes that were relevant to their contemporary times. Themes that was relevant to the times. The socio-political situation of the time were reflected in their poetry. And the people looked up to the poets for guidance. So the poetry of Victorian times reflected the socio-political situation. There were diverse influences that led to the culmination, that led to the emergence of the Victorian poetry. So we are seeing what are the factors that led to the Victorian poetry. The Victorian era was marked by drastic change in politics, in industry, in science and in religion. We have learned all these topics in our previous classes. The industrialization brought about rapid change in England. The urban industrialized towns had grown. The rotten boroughs were abolished after the Reform Act of 1832, the first Reform Act. There was a transition from agrarian farm-based life to industrialized town-based life in England during the Victorian era. And we have learned that many people migrated to the city in search of jobs in industry. So this was one of the social changes that was taking place during the Victorian era. The poems reflected the social situation of the Victorian era. We talked about the Chartist movement, the People's Chart, and the cry for universal enfranchisement and democracy, and it was heard by the parliament, and slowly democracy would be established in England. So that was another social change. Then the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin brought about a shift in the paradigm. The Darwinian theories challenged the balance between religion and science. This was another change that was taking place. People began to believe more in science than in the Bible. Than the Bible, that was the source of their religious belief. People began to believe in science. People began to believe in science more than their religious traditions. Then there was Karl Marx and his revolutionary Marxist ideology that was presented in the Communist Manifesto. And it brought about a revolutionary thinking into the minds of the people. So these are the socio-political cultural changes that are taking place during the Victorian era, and all this will be reflected in their poetry. The poets represented the situation of the society. And Sigmund Freud exposed in the interpretation of dreams new ideas about the human mind. The conscious mind is only a 10% of the human mind, like the tip of an iceberg. The rest of the 90% is unconscious, and it is unavailable to the human control. This was another thinking that was influencing the people of the Victorian era. There was a rise of democracy, we have already learned that, and the expansion of education. So another change that is taking place in the Victorian era. Why are we learning all these things? Because all these will be reflected in the poetry. So there was a rise of democracy and the expansion of education and the growth of the reading public. Now all these factors which I have mentioned and the influence of medievalism led to the emergence of Victorian poetry. As I mentioned previously, the Victorian poets integrated the socio-political situations, conditions in their poems, and we have seen what are the main socio-political changes that are taking place during the Victorian era. Now, the Romantic poetry preceded the Victorian poetry. We have learned about Romantic poetry, and we see a shift of perspective from the Romantic poets to the Victorian poets. The poets who preceded the Victorian poets, they are the Romantic poets. There is a difference in perspective between Romantics and Victorians. Now, the Romantic poets lived in a world of their own imagination. The Romantic poetry was written for the delight of the poet, himself than the delight of the reader. They gave more importance to imagination. We have learned them. We have learned the tenets of Romanticism. We have learned. They gave more importance to imagination, and nature was an important theme of their poems. So these are some of the very important characteristics of the Romantic poets. The Victorian poets, they lived in the world of their day, and the people looked up to them for guidance. The Victorian poets chose the subjects that interested the common reader, not imagination. Thus, the Victorian poetry was more related to life, more related to the contemporary situations. And with the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin and the growth of science and technology, the faith of the people was shaken. We have already seen it. The poetry of the age, the Victorian poetry also reflected the doubt, and at the same time it reflected the faith in God. So the Victorian compromise, which we have discussed, that also was reflected in the Victorian poetry. The growth of science also had a lot of impact on the poet's attitude towards the nature. The Romantics gave a lot of importance to nature. Now, the growth of science had a lot of impact on the Victorian poet's attitude towards nature. The poet did not see the divine element in the nature. The poet described the nature with scientific accuracy. There is another change in perspective. The poet described the nature with scientific accuracy. The Victorian poets can be classified as follows. There were many important poets during the Victorian era, and this is one classification that we can follow. The first, there were two major poets. The two major poets were Alfred Lord Tennyson and Robert Browning, and the Victorian poetry is also termed as the age of Tennyson. Two major poets. Then there were the skeptics. The skeptics were Arthur Hugh Clough, Edward Fitzgerald, Matthew Arnold, and James Thomson. Now, who were the skeptics? The skeptics are those who are inclined to question, or those who are inclined to doubt the accepted opinions. Whatever is accepted, they question. So they are the second category, the skeptics. And there is a third category of Victorian poets. They are called as the pre-Raphaelites. We will learn in detail about these group, pre-Raphaelites. And the poets were Daniel Gabriel Rossetti, William Morris, Algernon Charles Swinburne, etc. So this is the third category classification. And the fourth category of poets were the women poets, the Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Christina Rossetti, Charlotte and Emily Bronte, George Eliot, etc. So these are the different poets of the Victorian era. Now, before we end our class, we shall also discuss some of the characteristics of the Victorian poetry, some important characteristics of the Victorian poetry. Now, the Victorian poetry had some similarities with the preceding Romantic poetry, some similarities with the Romantic poetry. Skepticism, interest in the mysterious, and distrust of the organized religion were some of the common characteristics of both Victorian poetry as well as the Romantic poetry. The first unique characteristic of the Victorian poetry we can mention is that the Victorian poetry was light-hearted and humorous and sometimes nonsensical. So light-hearted, humorous and nonsensical, not very serious, lot of fun and even some nonsense. That is the first characteristic. The second characteristic that we can talk about the Victorian poetry is that the themes were realistic, and there were the general emotions of isolation, despair and general pessimism. Now this isolation, despair and pessimism, these are characteristics of the age. The industrialization brought about the gap between the rich and the poor, the pitiable state of the poor working class, that was reflected in the poetry. So a lot of skepticism, isolation, etc. The Victorian poetry had more realistic view of nature. The Victorian poetry, another characteristic is that the Victorian poetry had more realistic view of nature, while the Romantics had an idealistic view of nature. The Romantics idealized nature with a divine attribute, but the Victorians, they have a realistic view of nature. The next characteristic that we can talk about Victorian poetry is that Victorian poetry was much influenced by the conflict between the scientific discoveries. We have talked about Victorian compromise. It was influenced by the conflict between scientific discoveries and religion. The Darwinian theories challenged the balance between science and religion. It was reflected in the Victorian poetry. The next characteristic that we can talk about the Victorian poetry is that the Victorian poetry focused on the common urban dweller, while the Romantics concentrated on the countryside, the country rustic. Industrialization, urbanization was the situation of the Victorian era. So the Victorian poetry would concentrate on the urban dweller. The next characteristic that is very specific about the Victorian poetry is that the Victorian poetry was pictorial. It means that the Victorian poetry used detailed imagery to convey thoughts and emotions. The next characteristic is, even though many Victorian poets struggled with the loss of faith, there was still a sense of high morality that they held close and revered. So they held to morality. Through their writing, they tried to encourage readers toward more noble actions and attitudes. So there was the compromise between religion and science. People were losing faith, but the Victorian poets will ask his readers to be moral, keep to the traditional morality of the cultures. So these are some of the characteristics of the Victorian poetry. And there were many poets in the Victorian era, as we have just mentioned and classified. But the center of discussion was always Lord Tennyson, Robert Browning and Matthew Arnold, the three of them. The Victorian poetry was termed as the age of Tennyson. So in our next class, we shall discuss about Alfred Lord Tennyson. So my dear students, we are coming to the end of this short lecture on Victorian poetry. We have just introduced what is Victorian poetry, what were some of the common themes, or what were some of the characteristics of the Victorian poetry. We talked about the classification of poets. There were the major poets, Tennyson, Browning, even Matthew Arnold can be considered as a major poet. Then we talked about the skeptics. We talked about the pre-Raphaelites, and we also talked about some of the women poets of Victorian era. For your assignment today, please write a short paragraph on Victorian poetry, an introduction to Victorian poetry. Please mention the main important poets of the times and also write some of the characteristics of the Victorian poetry. So in our next class, we will talk about Alfred Lord Tennyson. Thank you for your patient listening and have a nice time.